Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Mukham Karoti Vacham Angam Langyate Yat Kripatamaham Vande Shri Gurudena Taranam Paramaham. Hare Krishna, thank you for joining. So we are resuming our discussion from the fourth canto, chapter 29, verse 70. If you can give me a minute. Okay, so this section of the chapter is essentially in answer to the question by Maharaj Prachinavari about how does the soul carry forth from one birth to another, from one body to another. And in 20 verses, Narad Muni, he explains the whole science of reincarnation. The essence of it is the role of the subtle body, specifically the mind, which carries forth the results of the activities from one life to another and influences the activities in the subsequent life. And not only the activity, it also influences the nature, the propensity, enjoyment, and suffering. So essentially, it establishes the law of karma. So resuming from verse 70, Namameti bhavayam purusha vyavadhiyate yavad buddhi manokshartha guna vyuhayanadima. Prem Kishore Prabhu, you want to read?
As long as there exists a subtle material body composed of intelligence, mind, senses, sense objects, and the reactions of the material qualities, the consciousness of false identification and its relative objective, the gross body, exist as well.
So this verse is talking about the connection of the subtle body with the gross body. Even if one would accept that the subtle body is continuing from one life to another, then Narad Muni still needs to explain that how does the jiva identify with the gross body? And here he is explaining that the aham mamatva. He says na aham mameti bhavo yam. That this consciousness of I and mine is essentially the connection between the subtle body and the gross body. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad states that in the previous verses, it has already been explained that because the subtle body is not destroyed when the gross body is destroyed, one cannot say that there is another doer or enjoyer in another life. Right? So the original premise that why should one in one birth suffer the consequences of activities in a previous birth if that person is completely different. In this birth, the person has no memories of the previous birth, it has no control on the actions. So Nag Muni has already established that it's the same person. It's like somebody wearing a blue shirt and goes and steals and then wears a red shirt and says that I'm wearing a different shirt now, so you can't hold me accountable. So the same person, the same subtle body is there life after life, the same entity that is also enjoying or suffering the consequences of its own actions. That part has been explained. However, there is another doubt that all actions are performed by a combination of subtle and gross body. In the absence of the gross body, the subtle body is no longer able to act. So in this situation, should not the living entity get liberation? So even though Prachinabhari is not raising these questions, Nag Muni is answering these questions for the benefit of future generations. That one may ask that if the aham mameti is only expressed through the gross body, then if the gross body is absent, then what it implies is the notion of aham mameti also disappears. Then at this point, should not the jiva automatically get liberation, because the cause of bondage is aham mameti. So what this verse is doing is it's explaining that even if the gross body is absent, the conception of the gross body will be present. So even though the subtle body may be without a gross body, but it will still carry the aham mameti conception. And conversely, as long as it carries the aham mameti conception, it will be forced to take on a gross body. So Nag Muni further says that these things are happening since time immemorial. That in the absence of the gross body, the conceptions are carried in the subtle platform. The activities are continued in the subtle platform. So the bondage is going on since time immemorial. Prabhupada says that in this verse, it is clearly explained that the subtle activities of the mind and intelligence continue due to the sufferings and enjoyments of the living entity's subtle body. The consciousness of material identification such as I and mine still continue because such consciousness has been extant from time immemorial. Extant means in place, has been existing since time immemorial. Okay, verse 71. Shukti murcho patapeshu pranayan vigataha nehatiham iti jnanam mrityu prajvarayorapi.
When the living entity is in deep sleep, when he faints, when there is some great shock on account of severe loss, at the time of death, or when the body temperature is very high, the movement of the life air is arrested. At that time, the living entity loses knowledge of identifying the body with the self.
So far it's been stated that because of the subtle body, a gross body comes. The subtle body has the aham mamatva, and because of that, the gross body comes. And because of this combination of subtle and gross body, transmigration is happening. Now, yet another doubt is put forward. Previous doubt was that if the gross body is destroyed, doesn't one get automatic liberation, because apparently the connection between the subtle and the gross body is causing transmigration, and that was negated by saying that even in the absence of the gross body, the subtle body has the desires for a gross body. So whether the gross body is there or not, the subtle body has that desires. So which is why the transmigration happens. Now the opposite position is taken, that just as the gross body is destroyed and recreated at the time of death, why can't we say that the subtle body is also destroyed? And won't that result in liberation? So then one may say or ask, when is the subtle body destroyed? So the line of reasoning followed here is that the symptoms of the subtle body is consciousness. So the times at which there is a loss of consciousness, they would indicate the destruction of the subtle body. So there are three stages that are given here: Jagriti, Swapna, Shushupti. So there is the jiva is in the stage of, not given in this verse, but given in the scriptures, that the jiva is either in the state of wakefulness, Jagrati, sleep, Swapna. So this is light sleep when one dreams. Shushupti is deep sleep. And the fourth is Turiya. Turiya is Samadhi. But going back to the point of the subtle body being destroyed, it's said over here, Shukti Murcha, Upatpeshu, and Pranaya. So there are four situations in which consciousness is lost. Shukti is deep sleep. So when person is in deep sleep, the consciousness is completely lost. There's no dreaming also done over there. Murcha is when the person faints. Sometimes because of excessive heat, sometimes because of hunger, sometimes because of fear, different reasons. Murcha, the person faints and loses consciousness. Uptapeshu is in times of great shock. So the great shock may be a physical shock or a mental shock. Sometimes when the pain that the body is feeling is unbearable, then one loses consciousness. Sometimes it may not be physical pain. It may be emotional turmoil. So the person faints. And then pranayan. Pranayan is around the time one gives up the life airs. So high fever. So at all these times, self-awareness ceases. So this one can assume that the subtle body has been destroyed. Then one might say that, but from a deep sleep, a person wakes up. And if a person becomes unconscious, then he comes back to consciousness. Then if a person is having high fever and faints, then he will come back when the fever is subsided. So then the counter to it is yes. But let's assume that at that point, the subtle body is recreated. How can you say that? Because we see empirically that the gross body is being destroyed and recreated. So there is precedence. So extrapolating that, we can understand that the subtle body may also be being destroyed and recreated. So if the proposition is that the subtle body is binding the soul to the material world, then during the times when the subtle body is destroyed, why does not the soul get liberated? Or should not the soul get liberated at that time? So Narad Muni in this verse, he countering that objection, saying that in all these situations, the subtle body does not cease to exist. While its effect may be diminished or covered, it continues to exist. So Srila Prabhupada explains that lack of awareness does not translate to lack of existence. For instance, we may not be aware of our spiritual self in the material world, but it does not mean that our spiritual body has been destroyed. So similarly, in all these situations, the manifestation of the subtle body gets covered. But it does not mean that the subtle body is destroyed. So combining this verse with the previous verse, it is addressing all possible objections to the science of reincarnation that Narad Muni has proposed. So he is doing it in a systematic way. So he has first given the science of reincarnation that is predicated on the subtle body, and then he is addressing any possible objections to it. Prabhupada in the purport, he extends this to the spiritual body. He says that we act sometimes in relation to the gross body and in sometimes relation to the subtle body. If by Krishna's grace we act in a spiritual body, we can transcend both the gross and subtle bodies. In other words, we can gradually train ourselves to act in terms of the spiritual body. As stated in Narad Pancharatra, Rishikena Rishikesha Sevanam Bhakti Rukchate. Devotional service means engaging the spiritual body and the spiritual senses in the service of the Lord. So, even though we may not be aware of the spiritual, Prabhupada is extrapolating it, that we may not be aware of the subtle body, but it exists. Similarly, we may not be aware of the spiritual body, but Shastra Chakshu tells us that it exists. So, because we lack awareness, we can't act on that platform, but we can train ourselves to act on that platform. So, the operative word here is train, which translates to sadhana Vedi bhakti. And that's why he says Rishikena Rishikesha, that we train to use our senses in the service of the owner of the senses. Okay, verse 72. Garbhe balyapya apau sakalya ekadas vidam tada lingam nadrishyate yunaha kuvam chandramaso yatha. I think I messed the meter, but please go ahead with the translation.
When one is a youth, all the 10 senses and the mind are completely visible. However, in the mother's womb, or in the boyhood state, the sense organs and the mind remain covered, just as the full moon is covered by the darkness of the dark moon night.
So Nan Muni is illustrating with an example over here to show that how the subtle body continues to exist even if its actions are not discernible. So the example that he gives is that of a child in the womb of a mother or in a newborn. So when a child is newly born, then he does not demonstrate any intelligence. So he does not demonstrate all the aspects of the subtle body. So the three aspects of the subtle body are mind, intelligence, and false ego. But in an infant, none of them three are visible. Like this, the child does not have any false ego. Even in young children, you see that you tell them, and we see that we see that change also. That like we have been running a Bhakti Vaibhava for more than 16 years now. So many of the devotees who have come to Bhakti Vaibhava, their children were small when they came. Now they're grown up. And then we see the difference also in our own son, that when they're small, they'll come, the parents will say, go to the altar and give obeisances. And they'll toddle over, give obeisances, and they're very happy. Or they'll say that Vaishnavas, give Vaishnava obeisances, and they'll fall at the feet of the Vaishnavas. And so there's very little false ego in them. But when the same, then they will demonstrate all three aspects of the subtle body. Right? Their mind, intelligence, and false ego will be strongly evidenced by the 11 senses. Ekadasha vidham tada. So 11 senses, as you know, are the 5 knowledge senses, the 5 action senses, and the mind. Right? So through these 11 senses, the actions of the subtle body are evidenced. This indicates that the subtle body existed all along, even when the symptoms were not clearly visible. So it's not that as the child grew, the subtle body was planted in the body of the child. Subtle body was always there. But depending on the situation, it may be covered, or it may be less covered or uncovered. The Prabhupada further explains this with another analogy. Narad Muni explains the analogy of a child. Prabhupada explains with the analogy of a moon. So he says that in Amavasya, there is no moon in the sky. And at Purnamashi, there is the full moon. But it does not mean that the moon disappeared and reappeared. It was always there. But situations were contributing to the fact that it was visible or not visible. So similarly, the senses of the living entities are there, but only become active when the gross and subtle body are developed. Unless the senses of the gross body are developed, they will not act on the subtle body. Similarly, because of the absence of the desires in the subtle body, there may not be development in the gross body. So expanding a little bit on this point made by Srila Prabhupada, that the fact that the gross body develops is an indication of the presence of the subtle body. Why? Because the gross body is developing to fulfill the desires of the subtle body. Now, the same cannot be applied to the decline of the gross body. That's not happening. That's happening against the desires. of the subtle body is happening because of the force of karma. So everything that is happening is because of a combination of desire and destiny. By the desire of the subtle body, the gross body grows, and by the force of destiny, the gross body dwindles. Unless the senses of the gross body are developed, they will not act on the subtle body. So if somebody is unable to see, then the subtle body will not develop any pushings because of sight, right? So the subtle body is relying on the senses of the development of the senses of the gross body. Now, conversely, if the subtle body has no desires, then the gross body will not develop. Right? So in this way, we can see the connection between the two of them. That the gross body is developing because of the desires in the subtle body, and the subtle body is acting because of the presence in of the senses in the gross body. So that's how these two are intertwined with one another. So as I mentioned, this is an example to indicate that the Narad Muni is indicating that because the subtle body and gross body are so closely intertwined, they are dependent on one another to manifest, not really so much for the existence, but to manifest. So even though the subtle body is not visible by its action, it may exist because it depends on the gross body to manifest its effect. A person may have a desire to fly, but if the body does not have wings, the person will not be able to fly. Right? So that aspect of the subtle body will never manifest. So if we extrapolate this, with what we can understand is that the subtle body will continue to exist whether its actions are visible or not, which means that the earlier proposition that was made that if the gross body is absent, the subtle body ceases to exist is negated. The earlier proposition that was made that there are times when the actions of the subtle body are not evidenced, like fainting or loss of consciousness, that is also negated. The subtle body exists. So essentially, Narad Muni is trying to prove that the subtle body is eternal in the material world. Okay, moving on to verse 73. Arthe haya vidya manapi samstrirna nivartate dhyayato vishayanasya swapne natha gamo yatha.
One second. When the living entity dreams, the sense objects are not actually present. However, because one has associated with the sense objects, they become manifest. Similarly, the living entity with undeveloped senses does not cease to exist materially, even though he may not be exactly in contact with the sense objects.
Okay, same point is being further elaborated. And Narad Muni is spending some time over here because these concepts are very crucial to transmigration. We generally accept it on face value because one is we have grown up with the notion, and second is all this line of thinking is really meant for those who are jnanis, which we generally accept the word of the scriptures on face value. And since Narad Muni is speaking for a wider audience, he is wanting to clearly establish the role of the subtle body in transmigration, with the ultimate purpose of showing how one can break the cycle of transmigration. So here he is saying that in states like deep sleep, there are obstructions to the subtle body's functions. Right? So the subtle body's functions of thinking, feeling, willing, they are all obstructed, but not absent. So some philosophers say that during deep sleep and final devastation, the subtle body ceases to exist because of it being merged into Prakriti. But the same philosophers also say that this is not liberation. It is simply another form of samsara, material existence. So an example is given by Narad Muni here that just as a person who meditates on sense objects perceives them in a dream, even though the physical object may not exist. Similarly, in deep sleep, though the subtle body does not function, there is still no liberation because the impressions have not been destroyed. So this is restating the same point that was earlier on made. That so this is especially true during final devastation. That when the universe ceases to exist, then the jivas, they are drawn back into the body of Mahavishnu. At that time, the soul does not have a subtle body. It obviously doesn't have a gross body, it does not have a subtle body. Now, by some divine arrangement, the subtle body is preserved somewhere else. Right? So when the assembly happens again, and that part is the mystical part, when the assembly happens again, when the glance of Mahavishnu happens on the Pradhan, and then the jiva enters and interacts with Prakriti, then it regains that subtle body. So it resumes its material life with the same sense of desires. But it is also said that while the jiva is in the body of Mahavishnu, it is very, very miserable at the time, because it has all these impressions that it wants to fructify through the agency of the subtle and gross body. So even though at one end, this is the ultimate desire of devotees, that let me be in my spiritual self in the association of the Lord. That's what is happening. But the jiva is still miserable because that's not what he wants. He says, where is my subtle body? Where is my gross body? So that I can continue to fulfill all these desires. Same thing also happens during deep sleep, that by influence the subtle body may cease to exist, but the desires are still there. So the examples of enjoying in dreams, it denotes that the person's enjoyment is not predicated on the existence of the object of enjoyment or the engagement with the object of enjoyment. Right? So the person's enjoyment is really predicated on the desire to enjoy. The other things are basically byproducts of it. But when the person desires to enjoy, that essentially is what is determining the destiny of the person. So how do we know that? Because in each one of us, we have a billion desires to enjoy. And out of those billions of desires, maybe 1/1,000,000th of a percentage, 1/1,000,000th of a millionth of a percentage of the desires are satisfied. So almost all our desires go unfulfilled. But it still is binding us to the material world, because it is not predicated on the desires fructifying. It is predicated on the desires being there. So similarly, the existence of the subtle body is not predicated on its symptoms being evidenced. It is predicated on the desires of the soul. As long as the soul has desires of aham mamatva, the subtle body will come into existence. Whether it is manifest or not, that is irrelevant. Right? So, the cause of the existence of the subtle body is not its symptoms. The cause of the existence is the desire to enjoy in the material world. As long as those desires exist, the subtle body will continue to exist, regardless of whether it is evidenced or not. Now, a side point that is made over here is that it is said that during deep sleep, the connection with the subtle body weakens. This is more of the mechanical connection. It weakens. So it is said that during deep sleep, the jiva gets a glimpse of Brahman happiness. Now one may say that in deep sleep, I feel nothing. And then you say, exactly, that is the Brahman happiness. Now, one may sleep for 10 hours in swapna, in the dreaming state, and the person will still wake up not fully refreshed, sometimes exhausted. They will break. But on the other hand, even a short duration of deep sleep makes one completely refreshed. So this is the mercy of the Lord, which allows the conditioned jiva to be continuously refreshed in order to continue with the hard struggle of material existence. Otherwise, the jiva will not be able to sustain. Material existence is so difficult that if the Lord had not given these brief contacts with Brahman happiness, the refreshment that comes with it, the jiva would simply die out of exhaustion. And the Lord is also giving a taste of Brahman happiness that leads one to the path of transcendence. So if we look at the gradual path of elevation, then the earlier aspects of the yogi is to be in the stage of nothingness. The meditation is so that one is not aware of one's material condition around, one does not feel anything, see anything, the mind is blank. So these are all stages when the subtle body is being disconnected, which essentially is a glimpse of Brahman happiness. So it is at least taking the jiva to the path of transcendence. This is more Astanga Yoga meditation, but Astanga Yoga also has a purpose. It leads to, one can then start meditating on the personality of Godhead. Prabhupada in the purport, he explains this with the analogy of a child. That Prabhupada says that it is sometimes said that because a child is innocent, he is completely pure. Actually, this is not the fact. The effects of fruitive activities reserved in the subtle body appear in three concurrent stages. Bija, which is root, Kuta, which is desire, and Phalomukha, which is about to fructify. This is also what we say as willing. So thinking, feeling, willing, that you are just wanting to do that. It's also called a prarabdha. The manifest stage is called also called a prarabdha. The manifest stage is called prarabdha, already in action. In a conscious or unconscious state, the action of the subtle or gross body may not manifest, but such state cannot be called the liberated state. A child may be innocent, but this does not mean that he is a liberated soul. Everything is held in reservation, and everything will become manifest in due course of time. Later he says that even if the reactions of the subtle and gross bodies are not manifest, one does not become free from the material condition. Therefore, it is wrong to say that a child is as good as a liberated soul. Prabhupada is debunking some of the these are more cultural aspects where somebody says that that children are another form of God, or they are liberated and later on they become conditioned. So philosophically, Prabhupada is clarifying that, and at the same time he's also reinforcing this point that one should not try to extrapolate the existence of the subtle body based on the symptoms. They're held in reserve. Even if the symptoms are not there, one can understand the subtle body is there, because when the gross body becomes ready, then the subtle body begins to manifest its effect. Okay. So I'll do one more verse and then we can pause for any discussion. Evam panchavidam lingam trivarta sodasha vistritam esha chaitanya yukto jivatyabhidya abhidyate.
The five sense objects, the five sense organs, the five knowledge acquiring senses, and the mind are the 16 material expansions. These combine with the living entity and are influenced by the three modes of material nature. Thus, the existence of the conditioned soul is understood.
So this is Narad Muni giving the composition of the subtle body. So he has talked about the subtle body for so many verses. Now he's getting ready to he's summarizing. So he's saying that subtle body that I have been speaking about for such a long time, it is made of 5 pranas, 3 gunas, and it is furnished with 16 transformations. So what are the 16 transformations? The 10 senses, the 5 sense objects, and the mind. So Prabhupada mentions that the material existence is first agitated by the 3 modes of material nature, and these become the living conditions of the living entity. Thus, the subtle and gross body is developed, and the ingredients of earth, water, fire, air, sky, and so on. According to Sri Madhavacharya, when consciousness, the living force in the heart, is agitated by the 3 modes of material nature, Then the subtle body of the living entity, consisting of mind, sense object, five senses that acquire knowledge, and the five senses for acting in the material condition, become possible. Okay, so let me pause here and see if there's any discussion.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Regarding the deep sleep, one gets a glimpse of Brahman realization, Brahman happiness. So is there any scriptural, where can I find that? Is it because I heard this before and I got completely flabbergasted actually. So one can sleep and then go to Brahman. Is it that we were discussing that a while ago? So now you are saying that there must be some. I thought that person who was telling was just speculating on some philosophical background, but then when you say that, it makes me feel that there must be some. Where can I find that?
So, unfortunately, the source where I got this from, the speaker did not give a scriptural reference. But just to clarify, the point that is made over here is not that during deep sleep one gets a glimpse of Brahman realization, but what the point is being made is that one gets a glimpse of what one would feel in Brahman realization. So it's not Brahman realization. It's not you go to deep sleep and you become Brahman realized. But in Brahman realization, the conspicuous thing that is absent is the subtle body. Obviously, the gross body is not there, but the subtle body is not there. Right? There's no spiritual connection, but the subtle body is absent. So because in deep sleep, the effects of the subtle body are highly diminished, then what one experiences resembles that which one gets during Brahman realization. Now, obviously, to get Brahman realization, the soul has to be positioned differently. Right? We know from Bhagavad Gita that the soul should be beyond any material attachments. So it's a state of conception of the soul that drives the soul to Brahman realization. That's an essential prerequisite. If it is not existing, Brahman realization will not happen. But symptomatically, this gives a taste of it. And the point that is being made is that just the glimpse of it is so potent that it is enough. Like Radhanath Maharaj makes this point, like the ocean of Vishayanand is condensed in a drop of Brahmanand. And then the ocean of Brahmanand is condensed in a drop of Leelananda. And the ocean of Leenanand is condensed in a drop of Premananda. So just the steps of increasing ecstasy, right? So it is a completely different platform.
And just one other clarification, Prabhu, regarding impressions, the vasanas. We generally say the impressions are carried by the mind, right? But now, according to your description of Sushupti state, when the living entity enters the body of Mahavishnu, it does not even have the subtle body. That means the mind is also not there, but still it carries the impression. That means it is not actually the mind which carries the vasana, it's actually the soul, but the mind is the medium through which it is being expressed. Is that the right understanding?
That's how I would describe it myself.
Oh.
Yeah. It's kind of the receptacle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Prabhu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So if there are-
Hare Krishna Prabhu, one question. I don't remember in which canto we did talk about. Basically, the question here, or not question, basically from the learning point of view, in order to have control on the subtle body, is it like it's a yogic practice, right? Like few yogis who are still existing, they have the control and what is it called? They have so much of control so that they can conquer the subtle mind, and even they can travel over the time when they exist today, right? That's the learning aspect of it. I wanted to learn on that. Like we did discuss this in some, I don't remember the canto on this. You did,
I know we talked about it in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita.
yeah.
But yes, I know what, the whole process of when the yogis, by the yogi power, they can separate the subtle body from the gross body, and they can travel at the speed of mind and not be. So once they're outside the gross body, then the laws of material nature, the physical laws of material nature don't act on them. So they can travel, gravity doesn't act on them, etc., etc.
So do we have to consider them that they can destroy the subtle body and they can go back as well if they can have that kind of
They're not really destroying the subtle body. What they're destroying or weakening is the connection between the subtle and the gross body, because it's the life aids that tie the subtle body with the gross body. So essentially, the prana. So when the person dies, then the prana weakens, and the subtle body, by its natural flow, it leaves the gross body and goes into another gross body where the prana then again ties it. But the yogis, they are able to weaken it. So then the subtle body can leave, and then they can get back, and then it occupies the same gross body again.
But
so we see when the yogis also do this astral travel, they have somebody guard their gross body, because for all practical purposes, their body is dead at the time. There's no subtle body, there's no soul in it. So at that time, anybody can come and destroy the gross body, because the body is essentially dead. It's just matter, lump of matter. So they will have somebody guard the gross body while they're traveling in this way.
and nowadays also they do say that, like what they call hypnotism or something. Is it like disconnecting both gross and subtle also, right? Even that leads to the same.
Yeah, not too sure. I would be speculating along with you, but they're all at a subtle platform. They're obviously affecting the mind and consciousness. So they're obviously acting at that level.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. It's not a question, but you spoke about this in text 32, the last line. Somehow, I'm not grasping it. Like you said, the Prabhupada writes that senses of the gross body are developed. Unless the senses of the gross body are developed, they will not act on the subtle body. Similarly, because of the absence of desires in the subtle body, there may be no development in the gross body. Like we see some people who may have underdeveloped, they will be they may be an older person, but their body is younger in stature, and even mentally they may be underdeveloped. Is that because of there's perhaps not subtle desires in the subtle body? Is that why it's like that?
So the point Prabhupada is making is slightly different. So he's trying to indicate the point that Prabhupada is making, that just because the symptoms are not visible does not mean the cause does not exist. Right? So the subtle body acts through the senses of the gross body. So if the gross body does not have the senses, then the subtle body will not be able to act. But that does not mean that the subtle body does not exist. So just because a person so if a person is blind, then the subtle body cannot see because it relies on the gross body. But then you cannot say that that person is free from lust. So considering the fact that people may see and become lusty, the nature of lust is that it sits in the subtle body. Now, the person may not act in the way. Another person who is able to see may basically act based on seeing. They see a beautiful form and they act lusty. This person may not be able to act in that way, but does not mean that the subtle body is not existing. I think the point that you're making is that sometimes the gross body lacks senses, like whether the person does not have eyes, or maybe the person is mentally handicapped. They're more a result of past pious, impious activities. They're
Basically, sorry, you also said is it not like a destiny? You said.
Yeah, so it's like impious activities that result in that particular kind of body. It's not really a reflection of the development or lack of development of the subtle body, because of past mostly impious activities. The person may get a body that is limited in certain ways. Not unless, in some exceptional cases where the person is an advanced devotee or is advanced in different ways. In almost all the cases, it just reflects the fact that the person is suffering karmic reactions. Is that okay, Harshana?
Yes, Prabhu. That was pretty clear. So the subtle body holds the desires, and it needs the gross body for the desire to come to fruition. The gross body to subtle body, that relationship is like, I'm wondering, how does that work?
Okay, so the first part you put it perfectly, right? That's what it is. The gross body to subtle body is slightly more simpler. That the gross body is simply a result of the desires of the subtle body. So the body that we get is a combination of what we desire and what we deserve. So the subtle body is the storehouse of all these desires, but it cannot enjoy or suffer them unless it gets a gross body. Now, the subtle body may have any number of desires, but what it gets is based on what it deserves. So the person may want a body of a demigod, but deserves a body of a human being. So it gets the human being body, and the desires are basically manifested through the human being, human body. So in this way, the gross body is dependent on the subtle body for its existence. And in the previous point that you made is that the subtle body, in this way, it manifests its presence through the gross body. That's how these two are interconnected.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Okay, thank you. So verse 75, let's see. So this chapter has 89 verses. It actually has 85 verses, and there are 4 more verses that are interpolated. So it has 89 verses. Later verses are shorter, the Palshruti verse. So we have 5 more verses in this area of the interrelation between gross and subtle bodies. So let's go to verse 75. Anena Pursha Dehana Upadate Munchati Harsham Shokam Bhayam Dukkham Sukham Chanena Vindati.
By virtue of the processes of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up gross bodies. This is known as the transmigration of the soul. Thus, the soul becomes subjected to different types of so-called enjoyment, lamentation, fear, happiness, and unhappiness.
So Narmuni is summarizing the entire process of transmigration in this verse. That by the processes of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up gross bodies. So the desires of the subtle body, the processes are combination with, and does not go details, but the processes of the subtle body essentially is the desire and desert of the subtle body. The living entity develops and gives up the gross bodies. This is the transmigration of the soul. So if you have to explain it in one line, this is transmigration. That by the processes of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up the gross bodies. Right? And what is the result of it? That the soul becomes subjected to different types of so-called enjoyment, lamentation, fear, and happiness. Right? So it is because of this that harsham, shrokam, bhayam, dukham, sukham. Happiness, unhappiness, fear, lamentation, and enjoyment. So Prabhupada says in the purport that modern psychologists can study the actions of the mind, thinking, feeling, and willing, but they are unable to go deep into the matter. This is due to the lack of knowledge and to their not being associated with a liberated acharya, as stated in Bhagavad Gita, Evam Parampara Prapta. Right? So Prabhupada is saying that they are not looking at it from a spiritual aspect. That the science of the soul also talks about the relationship of the soul with the gross and subtle body. And unless one understands this, one cannot really cure mental problems. So that's why Prabhupada says the modern psychologists, they are always unsuccessful. So so in the purport, Prabhupada expands further. He says that according to this explanation, one can clearly understand that the living entity was as good as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Right? Because Narad Muni is summarizing, Prabhupada is also summarizing, but Prabhupada is summarizing from the original existence, from the point that the soul was originally pure, like the Supreme Personality of Godhead. However, when the mind becomes polluted by desires for sense gratification in the material world, the living entity drops into the material conditions, as explained in this verse. Thus begins his cycle of material existence, which means he transmigrates from one body to another and becomes more and more entangled in material existence. Right? And then Prabhupada gives the process to reverse it. That the process of Krishna consciousness, by which one always thinks of Krishna, is how we can revert to the original spiritual existence. Devotional service means man manabhav mat bhakto. In these matters, we have authorized statements from Bhagavad Gita like Denosmyatade Komaram Yavanam Jara. So Prabhupada does a lot of references to the Bhagavad Gita, right? So clearly indicating how the two are interrelated, how they support each other in conclusions. In Bhagavad Gita purpose, he refers to Bhagavatam, not that much, but there are purpose that he refers to. But in Bhagavatam purport, he refers extensively to Bhagavad Gita. That's one literature that he refers to the most in Bhagavatam purports, which is Bhagavad Gita. So the essence of the Bhagavad Gita is in the middle 6 chapters, right? The 7 to 12. The essence of the middle 6 chapters is in the middle of them. So right in the middle of 7 to 12 is the 9th chapter. And the essence of the 9th chapter is in the 34th verse. Manmana bhaktu madhyaji mam namaskar. Right? So one might say that Sarvam Dharma Pratyajya Mahamekam Sharanam Braj. That is the conclusion. The essence of the Bhagavad Gita is Manmana Bhaktu Madhyaji Namaskar. Again, the verse comes twice. It comes in the 18th chapter also. So what is the summary of the process of transmigration? That the gross body acts as per the influence of the subtle body. So some of the facts that have been proven. That one, the gross body acts as per the influence of the subtle body. Second, the subtle body is not destroyed when the gross body is destroyed. Third point, as long as the living entity has material desires, he will be forced to accept a gross body. Fourth point, that once consciousness is expressed by present actions and influenced by past actions. And so this point was made, the connection between the past and the present and future. Fifth, thus the consciousness or mind expresses the past body and determines the future body. Then sixth, the fact that the mind carries past actions is evidenced by dreams. And finally, seventh, because the same subtle body is acting and dealing with the consequences, the action and the accountability is perfectly maintained through transmigration. Right. So this is essentially the logical thought process that Narad Muni has taken us through. Right. So actions impact consciousness. Consciousness impacts action. Since the consciousness carries from one body to another, past actions influence present actions, which in turn influence future actions. This is the law of karma. Because one is forced to acquire a body based on one's consciousness, one's body is continuously being adapted based on past actions. This is the law of transmigration. Right? So these two laws have been, the law of karma is incidentally shown, but what has been proven is the law of transmigration. Okay, so let's go to verse 76, 77. Yatha trinna jalukeyam napyatyapayati cha natyajen mriyamanopi pragdeha vimatim janaha yavadanyam na vindeta vyavadanena karmana maneva manushendra bhutanam bhavanam.
The caterpillar transports itself from one leaf to another by capturing one leaf before giving up the other. Similarly, according to his previous work, the living entity must capture another body before giving up the one he has. This is because the mind is the reservoir of all kinds of desires.
So Nag Muni is now in the summation stage. He's summarizing points he had previously made. Here he's summarizing the point that the mind is the cause of the repeated birth and death. And he's explaining that through an analogy that the caterpillar holds on to the previous leaf and until it catches to the next leaf. So only when it catches to the next leaf, then it gives up the previous leaf. Similarly, the jiva does not give up its previous material identity while dying until he gets a new material identity. So what that means is that there is never a moment of cessation of the false identity. So between death and birth, there is never a moment when this notion of false identity, just like for the caterpillar, never in a moment when it's not holding on to a leaf, either to the previous one or to the new one. Similarly, there is never a moment when the conditioned jiva is not without the notion of a material identity, either the previous or the new one. So Prabhupada explains that sometimes on the verge of death, a person remains in coma for many days before dying. So this means that while they have a new identity, they are unwilling to give up their previous identity. Right? And Prabhupada, he writes a pretty strong purport in it that, so Prabhupada does not name for obvious reasons, but he's referring to the first Prime Minister of India in the purport, to Jawaharlal Nehru. So Jawaharlal Nehru, before he died, he had a stroke and he was paralyzed. And but he continued to be the Prime Minister. And then he finally had a heart attack. And then he died. And then there was later on a famous astrologer who had studied the chart and had explained that Jawaharlal Nehru had taken birth again as a dog in Switzerland. So Prabhupada writes in the purport that a person may be enjoying the body of a prime minister or a president, but when he understands that he will be forced to accept the body of a dog or hog, he chooses not to leave the present body. Right? So it's indirectly referring to the fact that if you draw with the particular situation with Nehru, that he was in coma, indicating that his new body was there. But because he was very much attached to the previous body, he refused to give it up. So which basically put him in this transient state of coma. Prabhupada said, therefore he lies in a coma many days before death. This has been experienced by many politicians at the time of death. And then he said, those who are overly attracted to that life situation are forced to remain in a ghostly body. So this is the other extreme. So one extreme is that the person is unwilling to give up the material body, so they delay the process. So they give it up gradually, and then they go to the new body. But if in the extreme situation, they are unwilling to accept the new body, so they essentially stay in the subtle body. So they remain in a ghostly body and are not allowed to accept another gross body. Even in the body of a ghost, they create disturbances for neighbors and relatives. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada quotes 4 verses from the Bhagavad Gita. So these are good, what you can call it as a cheat sheet. And if you have to explain transmigration based on Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada gives these 4 verses. So he starts off with he doesn't start off, I kind of reordered it a little bit. But basically he talks about 1322 Purusha Prakriti Stoa Vamte Prakritam Guna. that the association of the spirit soul with the modes begins with a desire to enjoy, right? So that's the fall of the jiva, 1322. Then the next body is determined by the thoughts at the time of death. Yam yam vapi swaran bhavam, 8.6. Then what determines the thoughts? Depending on the nature of the modes, the soul goes to different bodies and planets, 14.18. Urdhvam gachanti satvastha madhyam tishnam pradha. And then finally Prabhupada says that how to break this cycle? The only way to break it, that to become Krishna conscious. Bhakti mam abhijanati yavanchashmi tattvatam. Then they don't take birth again. Okay, verse 78. Yada kashe charitandhyaya karmanya chinute sakrat sati karmanya vidyaya bandha karmanyanatmanaha.
As long as we desire to enjoy sense gratification, we create material activities. When the living entity acts in the material field, he enjoys the senses, and while enjoying the senses, he creates another series of material activities. In this way, the living entity becomes entrapped as a conditioned soul.
So this verse is answering the question of how the mind is the cause of samsara. That by the mind one meditates on the objects of enjoyment, so charittan, and because these acts are based on ignorance, it results in the bondage to the action of the body. And Prabhupada gives a more detailed explanation that in the subtle body we create many plans to enjoy sense gratification. These plans are recorded in the spool of one's mind as bija, the root of fruitive activities. Later it says, under these circumstances, it is to be supposed that by thinking, feeling, and willing, we are creating a series of future material bodies. So the thinking, feeling, and willing is then ultimately related to doing. Now, thinking, feeling, and willing are the nature of the subtle body. But because they are closely linked to doing, they result in the creation of an appropriate gross body. Depending on what one thinks, feels, and wills, one gets a gross body to do that. Prabhupada says that if somebody has a strong desire to enjoy meat, he gets the body of a tiger. Somebody has a strong desire to sleep, he gets the body of a bear and he sleeps for 6 months. So that's how the thinking, feeling, and willing are related to the doing. That's how the subtle body is creating gross body. And at the root of thinking is the desires of the jiva. So the desires of the jiva, they activate the thinking, feeling, and willing in the subtle body, which links to the doing in the gross body. And then Prabhupada says that the only way to escape this is to act for the pleasure of Krishna. If we act for the pleasure of Krishna, there is no bondage to the material activity. Okay. So I'll do one more verse, which essentially is the last instruction of Narad Muni, and then pause for discussion. Atastadapavadatam bhaj sarvatmana harim pashyam statatmakam vishvam stityutpatyapapyayataha.
You should always know that this cosmic manifestation is created, maintained, and annihilated by the will of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Consequently, everything within this cosmic manifestation is under the control of the Lord. To be enlightened by this perfect knowledge, one should always engage himself in the devotional service of the Lord.
So this is why Narad Muni was speaking about the transmigration. This is why Prachina Bari asked about transmigration, because this verse explains how to break the cycle of transmigration. Narad Muni is presenting it at the end. Srila Prabhupada has been presenting it in almost every purport. That there is this whole science of transmigration that is driving the soul from one gross body to another, but there is a way to break it. And the reason Narad Muni has explained the science is to indicate that in itself the science is invincible. Right? So he has gone this way and that way. He has presented objections. He has defeated the objections. He has shown how the gross and the subtle body are intertwined, how inevitably one leads to the other. So he has basically gone with different angles to show that how this process of transmigration is happening and how it is invincible. But then he says that there is a way to break it. And that is by devotional service to the Lord, which has always been the goal. This has been the conclusion that he presented to Prachina Bari before Prachina Bari asked about transmigration. And the reason Prachina Bari asked about transmigration was that essentially he was doing Karma Kand. The whole purpose of Karma Kand is to improve your situation in transmigration. Right? And the conclusion is that Karma Kand is useless, because transmigration will simply take you in different situations within the same realm of suffering. The only way to escape it is by bhakti. Right? So the final instruction is to counteract the ignorance of seeing the body as the self. One should see the Supreme Lord as a whole. Worship the Lord who creates, maintains, and destroys the universe. Right? So he says, Bhaja Sarvatma Harim, that one should engage all the senses, Sarvatma, in the worship of the Lord. Not just externally or mechanically, but invest the feelings. Sarvatma means the self, the essence, all of one's feeling in the worship of the self. Like Krishna says in 10.8, right? He says, Buddha Bhava Samanvata. Bhava. So Bhava means that with complete feelings, one should worship him. Or in 15.19, he says, Sarva Bhavena Bhavita. Bhavena Bhavita. That with complete fervor, one engages in devotional service. Now, this is not to negate Vaidhi Bhakti, where Bhava is not very strong, but to establish a goal for Vaidhi Bhakti. That ultimately one has to come to the platform of serving with feelings. So Prabhupada writes that that self-realization, understanding oneself as a Brahman or spirit soul, is very difficult in the material condition. However, if we accept the devotional service of the Lord will gradually reveal himself. In this way, the progressive devotee will gradually realize this spiritual position. So Prabhupada is, you see, using the word gradually. What does that mean? That he is reinforcing our faith in Vaidhi Bhakti. So by gradually following devotional service, right? And Prabhupada quotes 7.1, Maya Saktamana Partha Yoga Yunja Madashraya, that how by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me, with mind attached to me, you can know me in full, free of doubt. So if you see Prabhupada's lectures, he has given the maximum number of lectures on 7.1 Bhagavad Gita, Maya Saktamana Partha Yoga. And in terms of quoting, the verse that he has quoted the most number of time is 213. And there is a reason why he has done that. So if you will remember at the end of the Gita, when Krishna tells Arjun that you do whatever you want to do. So Arjun says, Nashta Moha Smriti Labda. So he says that Nashta Moha Smriti Labda, the two big obstacles have been removed. What are the two big obstacles? Moha and Smriti, like illusion and doubts. When these two obstacles have been removed, what does Arjun says that Karishase Vachanam Tava, that now I am ready to follow your instructions. So by following the instructions of Krishna, illusion and doubt are removed. And when illusion and doubt are removed, one becomes qualified to follow the instructions of Krishna. Right? So Bhagavad Gita 7.1 talks about the removal of the illusions. Like 7.1, 10, Krishna, Prabhupada gave 10.8, 15.19. All these verses are pointing to the fact that by following the instructions of Krishna, Maya Saktamana Partha, that full consciousness of me, that when you follow this instruction, your illusion and doubts will be removed. And then in 1873, he says that that only when illusion and doubt are removed, one becomes qualified to follow my instructions. Right? So how to overcome these doubts is described in 7.1. What is the process? That by hearing from Krishna or his representative, doubts will be gone. This is why Srila Prabhupada spoke about 7.1 the most number of times. Because only when the doubts are gone, then one comes to a position of Karishyase Vachanam Tava. Right? So that's why Krishna spoke about 7.1 in different, explaining it in different way. Now, what is the most predominant illusion? It's the bodily concept of life, right? Which is why Srila Prabhupada quotes 213, the Vosdenosmin Yathadeh, right? To show that the bodily conception of mind. So these are the two big obstacles. And that's why Arjun accepts the fact that these two obstacles are gone. So now I'm ready to follow. Srila Prabhupada, in a more macro level, he is acknowledging the fact that these are the two instructions that should change the heart. So that's why he speaks so much on 7.1 and 2.13. Now, if you look at this, it's a little bit of circular logic, right? So at one point it said that when illusion and doubts are gone, one can follow the instructions of Krishna. And then secondly, it is said that in order to follow the instructions of Krishna, illusion and doubts must be gone. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, or you can say a more Vaishnava way, saying the tree and the seed conundrum. What comes first, the tree or the seed? Because one needs the seed to grow the tree, and then from the fruit, one gets more seeds, right? And in order to get the tree, the seed is needed. So this is the conundrum of circular dependency. What comes first, tree or seed? And the answer is, it does not matter. That the question is irrelevant. The right question is, what is it that you have? If you have a seed, you plant it and get a tree. If you have a tree, then you break the fruit and get the seed. So similarly, this discussion of whether doubts and illusion need to be removed first, or following the instructions of Krishna needs to happen first, it's irrelevant. What matters is, what do you have? If you have service to Krishna, do the service to Krishna, and the doubts and illusion will be gone. If your doubts and illusion are gone, then serve Krishna. So it does not matter this comes first or that comes first. What may be baffling because of the circularity actually becomes the mercy. And because they are feeding into one another, it does not matter. You start at any point you have, right? So it does not matter what is there. What matters is what you have. So with this, the instructions on Nandmuni and Prachinabhari have ended. And following this will be the renunciation of Prachinabhari and the Falshruti. Okay, so I'll pause over here and see if there is any comments. Okay, if not, we'll end here. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindubhya cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Anant Koti Vaishnavind ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Nithai Gaur Premanande Havindi Gaur. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.